The concept of progressive decentralization is that you want infrastructure and leadership to be in place before you take something that the core team or the centralized entity is doing and hand it over to the DAO. When you don't have the progressive process, those responsibilities are transferred into a void. That's another thing that's historically been pretty poorly defined is like, what's governance responsible for? Is it responsible for one decision? Is it responsible for all of the decisions? Hard to understand what that should look like if you don't know who participates, who makes the decisions, and what you're kind of like modeling the DAO after. That's the role of the foundation, is to try to put in place processes, infrastructure, and also develop community leadership.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Roll Call, a Rehash production. I am one of your co-hosts, Diana Chen, and today I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Spencer Graham and Amy Jung. And we have a special guest today with us, Justine from Optimism Foundation. She is the head of governance there, and she is going to be joining us to talk about all things progressive decentralization and optimism governance. And I'm so excited to have her here today. It's so good to have you here, Justine. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's also fun because Spencer and Amy are both involved in Optimism governance as batch builders, so we get to work together on some of these things.
Perfect. So I would love to just dive right on in and get into your thoughts on progressive decentralization. I feel like I've had a little sneak peek into this already from our time working together in the past. And I've gotten to hear about your thoughts on progressive decentralization a little bit, but we haven't really talked about it in a couple of years now. So I'm really curious to hear how your thinking has developed since then as well. So to start off, let's just start from the very beginning. If an organization is thinking about progressively decentralization, how does that organization know when it's the right time to start thinking about that? What are those readiness signals that you look out for?
Yeah, this is something that we're kind of in the process of defining, to be honest. And so what that has looked like for us is understanding what the different milestones are towards handing over a responsibility or decision to the community, and then trying to, from there, understand what are the different dependencies or gating factors that would allow us to move to kind of like the next stage or the next milestone. I think in general, the concept of progressive decentralization is that you want infrastructure and also leadership to be in place before you take something that the core team or the centralized entity is doing and hand it over to the DAO. So that's the role of the foundation, is to try to put in place processes, infrastructure, and also develop community leadership, so leadership outside the foundation or OP labs that can take over the responsibilities that we're currently executing. When you don't have like a progressive process, what can happen is that those responsibilities are transferred into a void, kind of. And so there's no people in place to take those responsibilities on, or it's unclear who those people are. And there sometimes not a framework or a structure for how to think about making that decision. Like a pretty basic example of this is like, if a decision should be data driven, is that data accessible? Like, can anybody use it? Is it standardized? Can I use that data in any way? In the absence of those things, what you'll end up with is just like undefined groups of people making pretty subjective decisions, which I think we know is like not the optimal setting for decision making.
Yeah, I want to dive deeper into like the data-driven thinking that I know you've been a proponent of for a number of years. But, going back to some of the things you said, it sounds like if an organization hasn't developed out those processes yet, it might be too soon to start thinking about progressively decentralizing. What are some of the risks that organizations face if they try to jump into this process too soon?
Yeah, maybe I missed like the most fundamental part of this, which I think we're as an industry not great at right now. And actually what the team that's going to decentralize needs to do before we do anything, before we build infrastructure, before we develop leadership, is understand actually what the DAO is meant to accomplish, what the goals of decentralization are and like what the DAO is optimizing for. And I think right now, if we ask, Optimism's done a lot of thought over the past 6 months to try to come up with answers to these questions or to understand the answers to these questions. But I think there are still a lot of teams that don't have those things defined. And so it's really difficult to turn over any responsibilities to a DAO if you don't know like what it's supposed to be doing, who is supposed to be participating, and like what success for that DAO looks like. So I think that's like step one. It's going to be really hard for a completely decentralized community to figure that out on their own, right? That's like a thing that we saw in 2020. DAOs trying to do that, and it's just like very difficult. So I think that's like the primary thing that has to be in place, and then you want to build infrastructure. Can you repeat the exact question that you asked? Because I think I went in a different direction.
Yeah, no worries. I was also just going to say, I remember Amy talking about this actually when she was on Rehash about like how organizations can figure out what their goal is and with regards to progressively decentralizing. So I was just wondering if Amy could maybe rehash her like framework that she said on Rehash. And I'd love to hear, Justine, your like reactions to that too.
Well, I was actually thinking more about what I said on Rehash was related to the question that Justine was saying, like, how do you coordinate when various people have different visions or of like the why is different for how an organization should be decentralized or what the vision of what we should be working on is? Because I find that often there's different kinds of stakeholders. And when it's early within the team, it's easier to get alignment, right? And then as there's more parties who have different interests that have different strategies for how an organization might grow is where the tension comes through. And I think OP is such a great example of so many stakeholders, but now the super chain governance, there's so many layers of that. And just curious, like how you're thinking through that, because I don't even know if I have a framework for that. I'm just trying to learn from the best here.
Yeah, so I think that actually DAOs have made progress, and I am not a person who says that statement a lot, but we have made progress in understanding that we need a defined kind of like mission, vision. I think we're getting there to the point where people understand we probably need a North Star where it's clear what we're optimizing for. I think what we still need to do work on is like, what is it that we're even designing? And I think that answer will be different for each DAO, and that's totally fine. But what I think is not fine is that the designers of those DAOs don't necessarily have the answer to that question. So if you talk to different people, some people will talk about a DAO like it's a replacement for a government, like a traditional real world government. Some people will talk about it like it's a corporation. Some people will talk about it like it's more like a co-op or a social community. And all of those answers are totally fine, but you would design them differently, and you would have different participants, and they would do different things, basically. Sometimes we get into like, without the clarity, that it's like a mix of all of those things, which then makes it harder to answer the second question, which is like, who is participating? I think in the early like days of DAOs, it was like, well, everybody participates. And then I think over time, it's like, does that make sense for a product like the super chain? Or does it make more sense to have the primary stakeholders be actually the chains themselves or the applications built on those chains that drive the most sequencer revenue, right? So it's like looking at the set of responsibilities that DAO is responsible for, and then understanding like who should participate in those decisions, like who has the expertise, the experience, and is going to be the most impacted by the decisions that system makes. And then I think you can start to understand what the governance surface area needs to look like. That's another thing that's like historically been pretty poorly defined, is like, what's governance responsible for? Is it responsible for one decision? Is it responsible for all of the decisions? Like, what is that governance surface? Again, it's like hard to understand what that should look like if you don't know who participates, who makes the decisions, and what you're kind of like modeling the DAO after. So those are the things that we've thought a lot about, in part because we've gone through this transition from being just like OP mainnet to the super chain. And that has like a lot of implications for governance, including that OP governance becomes like a federal system that the chains interact in, and then they can have their own governance tokens or their own governance mechanisms and systems and do things at the quote like local chain level, and then they come to Optimism governance to make quote like federal level decisions. So that's a big change where these chains are like slow, to be honest. Like some of these are Fortune 500 companies, and so they just don't like move as fast as some other like governance participants will. So it's taken a long time to onboard them. Some of them also not familiar with DAO governance at all. But I think in the next year, we're going to see like this big transition to having these types of participants involved. And that will very naturally like influence how the DAO develops and what governance system needs to support.
Thanks, Spencer. I wasn't sure if Spencer was going to say something.
Well, I'm just waiting because it seemed like Amy was excited about this direction. I was curious if you wanted to like ask some follow-up.
No, okay, Spencer.
Was one thing that you said lots of interesting things, but one that I caught on is the challenge of making clear what it is the DAO is supposed to be doing, and not to mention why, but the figuring out how to, first of all, what is the governance surface area? What is it supposed to be governing? What is it supposed to be doing? And what can it do? And then also being clear and articulate and making that legible to the entire community feels like something that DAOs have struggled with a lot anytime that the answer to that isn't like everything. And we see this with Uniswap today, where like people are going like up in arms in some sense about the introduction of Unichain. They're like, token holders weren't consulted. And my somewhat cynical answer is, well, of course you weren't, because that's not part of what you have any power over. So why would anybody need to consult you on that? And that's, I say cynical because that's sort of like a realpolitik kind of answer, or it could be interpreted that way. But it's more like, I think the important thing is that Uniswap be able to do better is make clearer to everybody involved, like what actually is under the authority of the part of it that is a DAO. And at the very least, that could help the community come to a better consensus or change what is under the authority of the DAO if it doesn't fit what everybody's expecting or needing. But my main point is that that's really hard. And I don't really know yet, like how, I don't, like Amy said earlier that she doesn't have a framework for that. I don't have a framework for that. I'm curious how we all can think about that better.
It's really hard. We just put out 2 like working models for decentralization that attempt to map out what the milestones towards kind of a self-managing system where the foundation is just one of many actors keeping that structure running. And also what we call the decision diagram, which is an attempt to map out what the full governance surface area is. But the irony was not lost on me anyway, of having to simultaneously try to define what the path and the system is, and while also defining the tools that we use to talk about it. And then the other very hard part of this is that I wish that I could sit here and say, this is exactly what the path is and what the next 5 years look like and what the system looks like 5 years from now. But what we know from the past 2.5 years is that's impossible. It's realistically impossible because of the level of uncertainty and how dynamic the space is, basically. And so it's also hard to create tools that provide enough information, but also allow for the flexibility and the humility to say, this is like what we think it looks like based on today. And 1 year from now, this probably will look substantially different. And then it's like, how do you bring people along with you so that they understand like how and why the thinking changed, but also get them comfortable with the fact that like it is highly uncertain exactly how this is going to play out.
I mean, as part of like the feedback commission and just kind of having seen your team at work, I often see that you guys are always making that attempt because it's so important to keep expectations like as real as possible. And I think the challenge has always been the surface area in a DAO is so wide. You know, I feel like it's do you ask this group of people? There's like this group of people who feel excluded and then that group, and they didn't hear this before you did that. And so in the end, that communication is so challenging. And I guess like part of that reminds me of some tension between the people creating the rule, like governance always is this interesting tension, because you're often the purpose is to like manage the controlling of powers, yet you're defining the rules to manage those control of powers. So you yourself have to be really, really like diligent about checking yourself, but that usually lives within a foundation, right? Like almost every governance team lives in a foundation. So like, how do you think about the tension between foundation and kind of like external, and how you guys are sort of managing these relationships?
Yeah, there is always an inherent tension there, which I do understand where this comes from. Like there's precedent for foundations not turning over control, or like that relationship not being trustworthy. So it's like, I get it when people are, it's like they don't come in, they're not going to like take your word for it. You can't say, well, just trust us. It's like, that's a ridiculous response if you look at like historical examples. On the other hand, I also understand like core teams have spent years building this business, and it's super scary to turn it over to other groups of people to run. Like, so both sides, I understand where they're coming from. I think a big part of it is like transparency. Like to Spencer's point earlier, a lot of times there's not as much of an issue with the fact that control exists. The issue lies in the fact where people don't know where the control exists or who's in control of different decisions, right? And so then there might be a misunderstanding of, well, I thought we were in control of this decision and the foundation did it without us. Whereas if you just map that out clearly, I think that transparency can reduce a lot of that. Transparency extends to other things, right? Like just making information asymmetry, like trying to reduce the information asymmetry that there is, which is something that we're working on being better at. The other two things are like pretty simple. Like if the foundation is just always honest and always neutral, that will go a long way with the community. It's hard to do that in practice sometimes, but the role of the foundation is really to be neutral. And so you can't really have back channel favoritism happening. The foundation really shouldn't engage in a lot of politicking, which many do in practice. Like I think as clear as the foundation can be about what their role is, which is to be a neutral entity that bootstraps the system and then stay within the scope of that role, the more the community will trust them. Where you start to have like a big breakdown is if there's like specific examples the community can point to of the foundation not being transparent, not being honest, and not being neutral. And then it's going to just be like very hard to come back from that, given the historical examples that we have.
Do you feel like that sounds like a really worthy goal, but it strikes me that balancing that against helping to foster the ecosystem and governance in the like direction that like of your strategy, like that balance is a challenge. I feel like I'm sort of curious if you have examples that you've kind of run into or challenges that you've faced in terms of like trying to be neutral and then being so neutral and so like hands off in a sense that you're like, oh crap, we didn't do that right. Or like the community totally misinterpreted what we thought this was going to be. And now we have to like, anything like that you can remember?
So there are sometimes practical limitations to this, right? So there's certain things we can't be 100% transparent about because they're deemed terms that are confidential, for example, right? Or there are other instances, where like business needs kind of require certain things. We have a framework that has been very helpful internally, which is just, I think, published in the DAO archives, which is what we call the Legitimacy framework, which is actually a concept created or written about by Vitalik that we've just implemented. And so it's something that the engineering team can use and the growth team can use, because there's many instances that come up where it's like, should we do this thing, or how will the community respond to this thing? And it's been helpful to point them to that framework. What that framework basically is that there are 6 sources of legitimacy. DAOs depend on legitimacy basically because there's no external structure to reinforce their credibility or validity basically. So it's all internally created. So if you violate it, the DAO can collapse. Basically, nobody believes that the governance outcomes are valid and should be enacted basically. And the sources of legitimacy are participation, process, credible, neutrality. See if I have them all memorized. Performance and continuity. And then there's a 6th one, which is brute force. And that's the one that we try to avoid using at all costs because it's like, because I said so kind of option. It is like the least valid way to generate legitimacy for yourself. And so we try to use that as a framework across the collective whenever we're making decisions and make decisions in a way that increase legitimacy as opposed to decrease it. Everything is like a spectrum. There's trade-offs. You try to find the right balance. There's no clear-cut answer. My team's like frustrated with me all the time because they'll be like, can we do X, Y, Z? And I'm like, it's not like a yes or no answer to that question. It's like, if we did it, it'd be better if we did it this way. And like, we should try to do this to like limit this other thing. But there is no, it's always like, it depends. It's kind of gray. Like this would be better than that. But I can't tell you like the exact way to proceed here. That's like my job in general, I think.
So is that sort of the framework that you follow when you're talking about like using more data-driven metrics to make decisions instead of using like subjective decision making? Is that like your core guiding framework, that legitimacy framework, or are there other frameworks or other like processes you have in place for, like following when you want to make more data-driven decisions and make sure that people are, understanding why decisions are being made in like a logical way?
Yeah. It's not, I can explain the framework that we use for that. The basic hypothesis, though, is that using data to inform your decisions would increase legitimacy via performance. Performance is basically like the concept of having a track record, essentially. Or if there's a hedge fund and you don't know what their strategy is, but they have really good returns, like you probably think that's a good hedge fund, essentially. Where the thought process around like data-driven decision-making comes from is actually closer to our constitutional principles. We have 4, and the very specific one that this is related to is governance minimization. And so the idea is to like minimize that governance surface area that we were talking about as much as possible and only like require as much cognitive overhead from participants as is necessary. So the very like practical way we think about that is we talk about 3 types of decisions. There are predictions that need to be made. There will always be predictions the DAO has to make. And those can be informed by data, like by looking at your ability to make predictions over time. But that there's always going to be a subjective component there. Like, what do I think the North Star should be? It's a prediction's a guess, right? And then you can measure whether or not that guess was correct, and you can identify who's a really good prediction maker and things like that. But there's always a human element there. The second type of decision is a measurement decision. And this is where we think it should be like mostly data-driven, automated, algorithmic where possible. We're just measuring things. So you can allocate retro funding based on measurements like we did in round 4. You can manage a treasury using a lot of measurement, etc. And then the third type of question is a judgment, where literally only a human can answer this. There's no right or wrong answer, and there's no way to analyze this. And that's like, what is important to the collective? What are the values that the citizens have? And those questions are really important that you ask everybody, because there's otherwise no way you can't really like come to consensus on values, right? Everybody has their own values, and you want a system that kind of like equally represents those values. So that's how we think about incorporating more data into the DAO and minimizing the governance surface. It's surface area. It's really related to that measurement part. We think there's always going to be a very important human part, which is around making judgments. And then there'll be this prediction type of question, which is a little bit a mix of both.
Are there certain metrics that you think are always important for DAOs to measure? Or is it always like a case by case scenario? Because I think like people in DAOs and especially like in crypto in general are not the best like measuring things, because I think like people tend to be a little resistant to KPIs and traditional ways of like handling metrics, that they just stay away from it altogether. But if you have any advice about like metrics that DAOs should be measuring, how granular to get with the metrics to be most effective.
Yeah, this is like a huge topic. So there's a bunch of aspects of this we could talk about. One, I think, is like being data driven doesn't necessarily mean KPIs. So a good example of this is like if you think about economic policy, you can make it more data driven by saying we're gonna define what it looks like to be in a growth or a value stage as a collective. And that might take inputs like sequencer revenue, some kind of competitive landscape measurement, etc. And it might then output like what type of treasury management strategy you want. So like data-driven decision making or use of more metrics can also look like that. It's not just like an optimization target. We're early, like the second kind of related topic to this is we don't have good measurements for a lot of things, which is like the other problem. And so we're super early in figuring out what those metrics should be and how we should measure things, right? Like round 4 was a good experiment in that. We've issued RFPs for people to think about better metrics to measure things like the concentration of power in DAOs. We use like very crude metrics to measure these types of things. Level of decentralization is also hard to measure. And so what we're trying to do now is just like work with people who are very analytical and who spend a lot of time thinking about this and come up with like probably imperfect but incrementally better metrics that we can use. And then hopefully we keep doing this over time. We use them in practice. We see where they're flawed. We come up with new ones. But it's definitely like this is a big part of that bootstrapping piece, where it's like a lot of this stuff just doesn't exist right now. And so it's not an overnight process to have this data infrastructure in place, which is also why our path to decentralization might take longer, because in order to make, we think, less subjective decisions or more informed decisions, we have to create some of these things. We have to work with really smart people to understand what these metrics should be and how we measure them. And then you have to get the whole measurement system in place and then make it transparent and usable by the community. This isn't like a 2-week project.
And then you have to be careful that it's not like the wrong metric that is going to get gamed and you're screwed, which I guess is another reason not to enshrine the metrics too early or maybe even ever. So like how do you make credible commitments to like doing this sort of thing without being able to commit to like a specific outcome or specific answer?
Yeah, what you said is really important. Like the number one thing there is kind of like, maybe this is like a really controversial thing to say, but like to like never enshrine anything kind of, but you want the system to be able to sense and respond basically. And so if you've picked a metric and let's say like you can detect that it's like it's deviating 10% from like what it usually has done, maybe that triggers a vote that needs to happen where the governance participants can override that algorithm or select a new metric or basically step in and say what is happening here because something is going wrong. I think we think the same way about like the structures that we have in place right now. And there's a supernatural tendency for people to say, yeah, but in 5 years from now, will the Grants Council exist? And it's like, in a way, not really my role to answer that question. My role is to set up a system that allows for constant evaluation so that if the Grants Council is the best way to make decisions 5 years from now, it's there. And if it's not, something else is there. But the system has to be, we need to build a culture of experimentation into the participants so that this constant kind of reevaluation and trying new things continues when we're not kind of leading those efforts. And then 2, I think some of it has to be built into the infrastructure. And if you think about a governance minimized system where some things are just kind of running in the background, but you give people the ability to override, you also need to build in like an alert system that says like, okay, something is deviating too much and humans should now look at this, basically. And in that system, that's when you know when to vote. Right now, it's like, to be honest, like a little silly. Every year we have like an inflation adjustment proposal, and it's like, why is that happening every year? And it's like, oh, it just needs to happen on a regular basis. Ideally, it would be like the frequency that vote would occur would be based on like, okay, there's been a big enough change in the macro environment that we should revisit this decision. And
related to that,
I was just saying, it applies to metrics also, right? If the system is able to detect that a metric has become very gainful and then call a vote to be like, should we change this metric? That's the type of thing that we want to develop.
Related to that, I feel like a lot of things you talk about is this kind of like signaling mechanism and sense making that you have to receive like, okay, we're 10% off of this deviation. And right now it feels like there's really like the vote and a proposal vote, and then all the qualitative forum posts, Telegram channels, one-on-one messages. Like, how do you see the development of that? Because it can get wider right now with the there's just more and more people being involved. Are there any like tools or resources? Is there anything you guys are building that focuses on how do you capture that sense, like the signals, or, you know, a lot of it is qualitative. So how do you guys capture that in a more effective way?
Yeah, this is like this is like a really big space, and there's many aspects of it. I think right now we're in 2025. What a big focus of ours will be is just being able to understand which governance participants have which expertise and experience and knowledge, so that we can even identify who the participants are that should be part of a given conversation or should be making a certain decision. Or like right now, in the absence of this, we default to like plutocratic selection method. Basically, it's like, oh, it needs to be objective, so let's do the top X token holders. And one of the principles in our constitution is anti-plutocracy, so that's not super aligned with that. In terms of like broader like capturing sentiment or more of the sense making stuff, there's actually tons of cool stuff being worked on as it relates to the governance of AI. And they've been doing like a lot of experiments around like policy making and how people's like inputs or values should or shouldn't be incorporated into those policies or into like how the models are being interacted with. And so there's, anyways, I could like go into a lot of detail about the different cool tools that are being developed or that exist or have been piloted on a smaller scale. It's actually, anyway, we don't have enough time basically to focus on the whole area that is there. But I think that's a super underexplored space in DAOs. I think in general, we use voting as like a super crude mechanism to extract information about a group's views. Actually, what you're doing actually is you're not even aggregating information. You are simply determining what the majority viewpoint is, basically, like what the majority view in power is. But right, like if you have 51% approval threshold, you see up 49% that like don't agree with it. And that's not even close to like consensus or reflecting collective wisdom or collective intelligence. And so we do have a framework. We have like a decision design framework that thinks about when like rough consensus is good enough basically to move forward with something, and when it's not. And when it's not, you want to maybe do things like deliberative processes or use NLP models or do like a much richer analysis of what the viewpoints are, what the sentiment is, etc. It's always like takes more time, costs more effort and money to extract all that information. And so you also wouldn't want to do it for everything.
It feels like there's a risk of doing that for, I don't think this is quite the right word, but for the wrong things. Like those kind of sort of collective deliberative processes that I know that Optimism has been running, probably not just in the context of a lot of badge holder things, which have been great, by the way, but probably in other contexts. But sometimes I feel like there's a risk that another Vitalik framework that I really like is the convex versus concave kind of decisions or worldviews or scenarios. And those like collective deliberative processes are really good for the concave like side of that spectrum. Yeah. If my concern would be about using those processes for convex decisions, where like you are able to get a lot of information about what the various stakeholder groups want and what their incentives are and what would be good for them. But inevitably, because it's convex, you kind of have to pick one of them. And then there's this risk of you've asked a bunch of people to participate, but then you are like very intentionally, or like the structure of the decision for that needs to like ignore a bunch of that in a sense. So how could we all think about like the tension between the need to incorporate lots of viewpoints on different things, when in some cases the decision maker needs to pick a path that is going to not involve a lot of the input from a lot of those stakeholders? How do we navigate that? I have no answer at the moment.
Yeah. So we did a deliberative process experiment. Eliza's about to publish a 19-page paper on it. So it's super interesting, some of the takeaways, and we'll publish that maybe next week. I think, so we thought a lot about this after running that experiment. I think it makes sense in terms of, earlier I mentioned the three kind of decision types: predictions, measurement, and judgments. Judgments being human values, where you want to represent everybody, basically, because there's not a real way to come to put consensus on values. I think that type of work makes sense on judgment questions for values, for example. I think where we've run into problems in the past is not clearly distinguishing what was a prediction, a measurement, or a judgment question, and then people conflating it, right? So it's like, we actually want you to make a measurement decision, but you're bringing values into it, and we haven't been clear enough about that distinction. That in the absence of that clarity, it's like values are coming into, or judgment is coming into a decision that's not really a judgment question, and vice versa. So that's like one factor. I think convex and concave makes sense also. Like concave is the classic example, is like if you have a jar of jelly beans or whatever, and everybody guesses how many jelly beans are in that jar, you'll get close to the answer. So a concave question benefits from having a lot of people guessing. And there are certain questions like that. And then a concave question is like the opposite. Basically, you want a few people that have super high expertise to make that decision, and that's how you'll get a better result. So yeah, I think it's fair to say, like, basically querying everybody for their opinion on a concave question is not going to result in the best answer.
And it feels like, there's such a process in it. Like if we think about that, there's a design process where there's like, in the beginning, if you're writing a book, you want ideas like maybe wide or whatever. And then when you're editing, you're kind of wanting to only narrow down in people who understand that audience. And so I feel like in that process, as you're going through the process, there's different kinds of decisions and kinds of people that you need to incorporate. And maybe like you said, sometimes people just not aware of where they're supposed to come in. This happens when it's like someone asks me, can you review this doc? And I'm like, should I edit this? Should I go for like content? Like what should I be giving feedback on?
Yeah, I think in general, people will comment a lot and say, oh, you have really structured thinking on the different frameworks and stuff that you use. And that's really come from having to scale my thinking to like the rest of the team. So in the beginning, it was like I was the bottleneck, because everything that touched governance, it would be like, Justine, what do we do? Or like, how do I design this? Or are we allowed to XYZ? And I was like, oh, this, like, I'm a huge bottleneck. So how do I get like what's in my brain to other people's brains? And these frameworks have been helpful for that. I think it's also helpful for us to refine our own thinking and understand, like, I don't think any of these techniques are like bad or should be used in isolation or never used. So for example, I think there's times when direct democracy makes sense. And I think there's times when delegated or representative democracy makes sense. And I also think there's times when it's horrible. And I think that there's times when you want to use random sampling. And I think there's times when political dynamics are okay, and sometimes when they're really bad. And it's just like, I think we have to have enough clarity in our thinking about like what the question is, what is the nature of that question, what is the best way to answer that question, and who should answer that question, to be able to distinguish between when we should be using these different tools. I think like DAOs, we have an industry have a tendency to be like, we tried this thing and it doesn't work, next thing, and then we're like all in on the next thing. And then like something's wrong with that thing in like certain scenarios. So then it's like, that was trash, like next thing. And it's like, these things are like all good for different things. So we just got to stop like using one tool for each thing and develop our thinking about when each of these tools like results in a good decision, which is hard, obviously.
And direct democracy is really bad at doing exactly that, which I think is one of the reasons why DAOs have like whiplashed across all these different approaches and have struggled to integrate and, you know, pick the right tool for the right job, as you're describing. Yeah, because there either is somebody who is like a pseudo dictator and then it doesn't matter, or like there's nobody really in charge who has the context necessary. And that is the trade-off that I feel like is one of the most challenging for DAOs. Like, how do you create, and I think this is what you're describing earlier, like trying to create leaders and foster leadership. Like, how do you create people that have the context necessary without like entrenching them in powerful positions?
Yeah.
That one scares me a lot.
So that one is, direct democracy, really bad for a certain set of decisions. I think many examples of that. I think super useful for asking people judgment questions, like what is important, or how do you think open source should be, what multipliers should be on open source projects or retro funding or something like that. Representative democracy, good for certain things, also bad, like flawed in many ways. And what you tend to run into more there is like entrenchment of power, like power dynamics, heavy politics, and the downsides that come with that. And so there are it's good for a certain type of decision, but I think, again, not all of them. So I think we think sortition is really interesting, which is basically stratified random sampling. In order to do that in a way that's useful for DAOs, I think that that requires you to be able to stratify your participants, basically, which means you need to be able to identify different characteristics that they have. Like if somebody has technical knowledge, or if somebody has, I don't know, what other characteristics, defining these things are hard, then you can sample a group of people that you know has a certain set of knowledge to make a decision that knowledge is required for. And that system doesn't become entrenched, because you're kind of always changing. You can guarantee a minimum level of context and knowledge without having it necessarily always be the same people. I think we use the council model in the collective. I would be very surprised if that were the dominant model that we're using for decision making 3 years from now, because there are power entrenchment issues there.
The council model, in the sense of like the membership of that council is stable over, you know, some longer time frame versus like more faster rotating membership, or like more like ad hoc council formation based on a sortition process.
Yeah, I think persistent and or political membership of the council, or plutocratically determined. I think those are the problematic parts of that.
What is political membership? What does that mean? Like elected?
Yeah. So I think we think of there like being 3 types of in our DAO, and one is like executive. And that's just like I execute a function. I run the algorithm that the DAO has chosen. I enact a protocol upgrade that the DAO has approved, like Security Council. Ideally, those people are like what you could think of as like civil servants, and they're just like executing a job on behalf of governance. They probably shouldn't be elected. The people that do that probably shouldn't be determined via a political process. You have other rules that are more like legislative, that are actually like agenda setting is the politics term, or like writing the policies. Those are typically like politically determined representatives. So I think it's okay in that model, and maybe they need to be accountable in that way to the DAO. And then there's like a third set, which is like what you can think about as institutions, which basically set the ethics and expectations. You could think of a core dev program as that. You could also think of, well, there's different groups in our DAO that serve this purpose, and they are like determined, membership is determined by meeting a set of criteria. So it's not political either. I think when you
How do you think about accountability in the non-political cases?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like many of the same accountability mechanisms would apply, right? Like you need transparency always to even hold anyone accountable. And then two, it's like the ability to remove or revoke is essentially the ultimate accountability mechanism. That's what we have with politically elected representatives right now. You can also get into like a weird situation where, yeah, you can have like theoretical accountability, and then in practice, it's just unlikely because, yeah, anyways, for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of what we've talked about today is that there is a lot of nuance and balance required in making DAOs succeed, both of which are not our strong suits in this industry. And so it's no surprise, I guess, that, we haven't exactly reached the point that we want to be at yet. I know we've got to wrap soon. Justine, do you have any final thoughts about anything that we've talked about or haven't touched on that you think is important for people to hear?
It's a big question. I think just that we're like very, like, if there's other people that think about this and have their own frameworks for thinking about these things, like, we're very open to collaborating. We actually have announced that we're going to do a joint experiment with the Uniswap Foundation. Like, we are trying to chart a path here, but we also know that we don't have all the answers. And so in order for like all of us to figure this out as an industry, we're all going to have to work together and like share learnings and information, and I think collaborate, because it's a very unknown.
Yeah, 100%. What is the best way for people to stay up to date on anything that's developing in the Optimism world as it relates to governance, and also for people to keep up with you as well?
The Optimism Gov Twitter is probably the best way to get like the major highlights. The forum's very overwhelming, so I wouldn't start there. And then I don't tweet a lot, but I'm Lala Lavender on Twitter. And if I do tweet, it's just to open source the frameworks and stuff that we're working on. So yeah, you can get access to that stuff there.
Perfect. We'll include all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much to my wonderful co-host for joining. And of course, thank you to Justine for joining us today. And come back again next week for another episode of Roll Call.